Dr. Martha Burns is the author of over 100 journal articles and multiple books. She's a neuroscientist and a leading expert on how children learn. For over 30 years, she has served on the staff at Northwestern University. So please help me welcome Dr. Martha Burns.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and welcome everyone. So delighted to have you all join us today. We have almost a couple hundred people on, so that's just terrific. And as you know, we're going to be talking about the neuroscience of English language learners. My goal is to answer some of your questions. Neuroscience has really begun to have answers to a lot of questions that we had about what's the best way to teach the English language to English language learners, when is the best time to start, what are the advantages of being bilingual, and what are some of the problems that you might face if you're educators or parents. And so that's really the goal for today. So what I'd like to do is just start explaining how that affects the human brain and what we know about what second language learning does in terms of the way the brain is organized, also how the brain differs depending on when the second language is learned, and then after the critical period, that is once students enter school, what is happening in the brain, and what are some of the challenges we as educators are facing, or parents as well. And so on this slide, what you see is that you see individuals who have learned a second language when they were very young, when they were just 2 or 3 years of age, or maybe just from birth. And then on the right-hand side, you see the brain of children who have learned a second language after they enter school, usually around 5 or 6 years of age. And these slides were done by Joy Hirsch. She's a neuroscientist at Columbia University, and she was actually doing these fMRIs of true bilinguals, that is, individuals who could be interpreters, for example, for the United Nations. And on the left-hand side, what you do see is that we have someone who's learned English and French at the same time. So we have an English language learner, and on the right, you see the English language learner and a Turkish learner who learned the language at the same time, and when they were quite young. And what I want you to notice is on the right-hand side how that little orange area there is part of the frontal lobe. It's a part of the frontal lobe that talks, and that whole region, the red, orange, and yellow region, is the part of the brain that's active when a person is thinking about words in either their native language or their second language. And what you can see is there's a lot of overlap in this particular person who learned, we call them an early bilingual, who learned their second language very young. And that's during the setup period of the brain, when the brain is just forming itself and getting ready for to mature. And so you see, A, the language area is quite large, and B, you see that there's a lot of overlap of the two languages. And what that means is this person really will never have to translate from one language to the other. They will probably never have an accent in either language. They just have one big language. We could call this person's big language Tinglish, because it includes English sounds and Turkish sounds and English words and Turkish words, and it's equal. But if you look on the left-hand side, you see what's more typical of the students that you and I are all working with, and those are students who are coming to us with one native language, and by the time they enter school, learning a second language. And of course, the second language is English. And that part of the brain, you can see, is very demarcated. That is, you have English, that's the red, you have French, that's the yellow, and there are no shared neurons, no overlap, which means that this person goes from one language to the other. They switch. And they probably, in their second language, in this case it's French, would have a little bit of an accent and would often have to translate. But the important thing for all of us working with these children is those children have to carve out another area of the brain, whereas a child who's been exposed to two languages equally when they're quite young, it's as though the brain says, oh, there's just one big giant language. And so that tends to make a difference. Now, what I talked about was this idea that there's a setup period for the brain. And so if you're learning a second language during the setup period, then your brain is going to be different than if you learn a second language after the setup period. So we say the brain is actually wired for language, and it turns out that learning a second language is the early test of the brain's language learning kind of capacity, if you will. At birth, we have equal potential to learn any language, but by 6 months, we begin to build the phonemes specific to our native language. So the brain of a young child is actually a language learning machine. That's what it's all about, and that's what that child is going to be interested in. One important aspect of development from birth to 5 years of age and of brain maturation is language. Now, there are other important experiences the child needs. The child needs experiences with movement and with play and with socialization. But almost the entire left hemisphere is devoted to language. And when we look at scans from several years ago, one of the things that we can see is that this left hemisphere is consumed, especially the top of the temporal lobe, by language and by stimulation from language itself. And so what that means to us is that the brain starts out being interested in language, setting itself up for language, and then over time what's going to happen is that the brain map is going to continue to refine itself. And I want to explain a little bit by what I mean by that. The brain starts out with kind of a general language capacity, and all of you who've ever been around young children know that. So a child calls his mother mama, his father papa or dada, and he's not using the word father and he's not using the word mother yet. He's getting kind of a general phonemic idea of what a word is like. In a bottle, the child might say baba, and for something like being picked up, the child might say up. They might even not put the P on. But over time, what's going to happen is the sounds of the language are going to become mapped much more precisely. And you can see this in the slide where you see tiny little dots on the left-hand side of the brain there on the temporal lobe, at the surface of the temporal lobe, that represent each of the sounds under D. When you look at D on the side and you see the phoneme D, B, P, G, all the way down to the phonemes at the bottom, which are and ng. And the brain, those little areas are little cells that are becoming fine-tuned for those specific sounds. But it takes time for the brain to tune itself like that. And we can think of that tuning as very similar to the keyboard of a piano. So in actuality then, what we have is this keyboard in the brain, but instead of it being notes on the temporal lobe, if you're a language user, each of those keys is going to be a representation of one of the sounds of the language. So a child who's raised in English has a keyboard of about 44 keys, if you want, because we have 44 speech sounds or phonemes in English. But a child raised with the Spanish language, the keyboard is different. It has 26 phonemes. And so one of the things that has to happen if you want to learn a second language is that you have to be tuned to the second language. And we need to make sure that that keyboard is accurate and finely tuned for both languages. So one of the things that the Fast Forward scientists who developed the Fast Forward programs did was they designed a computer program called Fast Forward Language or Literacy if a student is older, where the exercises actually, many of them are designed just to build and tune this inner keyboard for the English language, just working on perception of the sounds and making sure that the brain is fine-tuned. Once the brain is fine-tuned, then it's much easier for a child to learn the words, it's much easier for them to learn the grammar, it's much easier for them to understand what's going on. If the brain isn't fine-tuned, then speech sounds kind of muddy like this. So I just put my hand over my mouth to make speech very muddy, and what you can see is it's very hard to understand. So when the keyboard isn't tuned, even though a child may know some English words, unless the teacher speaks them very distinctly in a very quiet environment, very slowly, the sounds are muddled, and it's very hard for the child to pick up on what's being said. Now, since so many of our students who are English language learners are English-Spanish learners, I want to just talk a little bit about comparing those two languages just to give you a feeling for what they have to face. And so what you see is that there are several English phonemes that don't even occur in Spanish. For example, the sound in the or thin. Those are two different sounds. Actually, one is th and one is s, or the z as in the word zip or menus at the end of the word. Those are sounds that we don't have in Spanish. And over on the right you can see some English phonemes that are similar to Spanish phonemes but not quite the same. So anyone who's an English language learner, and I know we have a few people who said they came from Cuba or other Spanish languages, know that in the Spanish language the R is more of a trill. In the English language it's a very, very hard sound in a lot of words. And children have to learn that those are equivalent in terms of graphemes, but they aren't equivalent in terms of the way they sound. And so there's a lot of fine-tuning that has to go on in the English language learner, and it doesn't matter what the language is. Now let's talk a little bit about advantages to being an English language learner, or to be advantages to being bilingual in general, because I've talked about some of the challenges, but it's important to know that researchers, especially neuroscientists, have now discovered that when people learn another language, they actually develop some advantages, some cognitive advantages that those of us who are unilingual, like myself, don't have. For example, it helps to improve their attention, helps to improve their self-control, helps to improve their ability to deal with conflicting information. So there are a lot of advantages to being bilingual. So we want to encourage bilingual learning, even in our students who are not English language learners, who are native English language learners. Now, another thing is bilinguals are also better in general with mental competition. We know from research done by Judith Kroll, who's an expert on bilingualism. She is the director of the Center for Language Science at Penn State, that a true bilingual can keep both languages in mind and separate at the same time. So a true bilingual can do something I can't do. I know French, for example, but I can't be thinking about what I'm saying to you in English and at the same time be thinking about the French words that would be the same. I would actually have to stop speaking in English and start trying to think about how I might produce this in French. And yet bilinguals are able to do that according to her research. Considerations that I'd like you to make when we're talking about these students. The first consideration is that native language competence is very important to learning a second language. So that one of the things we know now from neuroscience research on English language learners is the better their Spanish or the better their Asian language, whatever it is, Chinese, Mandarin, Japanese, how good their native language is, does affect and does predict how quickly they will learn a second language. And so for those students, sometimes immersion is actually very frustrating for them because they don't have good language skills to start with in any language, and then we put them in a second language classroom, in an immersion classroom, and it just may become overwhelming to them. A second implication is that the evidence suggests that older second language learners really benefit from direct instruction better than immersion. So whereas immersion seems to be the way, it's obviously the way a young baby learns language, and it's the way a child learns language during what we call that early sensitive period of brain development. But as students get older, the research suggests that they direct teaching of grammar and actually auditory training of the speech sounds and actually direct teaching of vocabulary is much more effective for those learners. Now, another implication for educators, one of the third that I want you to think about, is that English language learners who are from homes where parents have non-standard working hours or undue stress are going to need, in addition to language interventions, they're also going to need cognitive interventions. They're going to need interventions that help build memory skills and attentional skills, because one of the things we've learned is that poverty affects the development and maturation of those skills. Now, I want to keep in mind that that doesn't mean that those children aren't as smart. It just means that they're smart in other areas. So children from homes of poverty might be excellent athletes. They might be excellent at drawing or music. But the problem is where the poverty is going to affect them is in learning language, learning to read, learning mathematics. And so and having good attentional skills and good memory skills. So the importance here of this message is that that we want to make sure that in addition to language training, second language training, we're also building up these cognitive skills. And then the fourth that I want to share with you, the fourth consideration, is evidence that students should be encouraged to use both languages. That no matter what their native language is, the ideal is not to say, okay, now we're going to get you to switch and I only want you to use English all day during the day. But actually there is tremendous advantage to them using both languages, that it builds their frontal lobe structures that are important for attention, for self-control, for being goal-oriented, and that language switching also seems to help with right hemisphere as well as left hemisphere language skills. So it's really quite good for the brain in general. So let's just talk briefly about the Fast Forward program and some of the things it offers that you don't get in traditional second language learning situations. One is that the Fast Forward program uses exaggerated phonemes. It's patented. It's acoustically modified speech to teach the brain to distinguish and lay down and fine-tune the keys for the English language. So in this slide, what you see is just an example of sip versus chip versus dip versus zip. Some of those sounds that aren't even in Spanish, like a z, for example, so that the child can be trained. They might see these slides one time and hear the word chip, and then they don't see this slide for a while, and when they see it again, they hear zip, and they don't see it for a while, and a little bit later they hear the word sip instead of zip, and they have to build those distinctions, and that fine-tunes that map in a way that it's really difficult to do in a classroom or in a direct teaching environment. Another point is that the Fast Forward programs build up basic language skills. They're building English vocabulary. They're building English grammar. They're building recognition of both school vocabulary and other vocabulary, so that by building the language skills, you're making language processing skills go faster and easier. And what that does is enable the students to learn so much more easily. They can learn to spell and read and write more quickly. And teachers can move on and do what they want to do best, which is actually teach content, teach science, teach geography, teach social studies, teach reading in the English language, and not spend so much time on teaching English itself. And then finally, it's important to understand that the Fast Forward programs are neuroscience-based, and neuroscience-based technology enables the student to also build those cognitive skills. So it's actually in building what we call those executive function skills of enabling the students to pay better attention in class with quite a bit of research, to remember what went on in class, to be able to hold that in their mind, to remember what they read, to be able to hold that in mind so they can comprehend better. It improves their processing speed so that they can handle the English language and listen to a teacher and follow the teacher at the same time the teacher's speaking. And finally, it builds sequencing skills, which are essential for mathematics, but also essential for learning the English grammar, learning to read, remembering what came in the first sentence, what was in the second sentence, the information at the end, and so on. So the products that we're talking about, the neuroscience-based technology, are the Fast Forward products and the Reading Assistant products. Fast Forward, I want to emphasize, is one of the top-ranked English language development interventions on What Works Clearinghouse. And Reading Assistant is a wonderful program for English language learners after they've started to acquire the language, where they get to read aloud, and that program listens to them and corrects their English as they are reading. So it really fine-tunes not only their math, but it fine-tunes their ability to speak and speak accurately and improve their English production.
Thank you, Dr. Burns. That was a great presentation today. We will take questions now. How does this work with existing curriculum?
Well, what I like to say is Fast Forward is not a substitute for curriculum at all. It augments the curriculum. It makes the curriculum effective. It makes the teacher able to teach the curriculum. So Fast Forward is not curriculum-based. Fast Forward products are neuroscience-based. They're designed to build up the capacity of the brain to learn, kind of like aerobic exercise builds up the capacity of your body to be fit and to be strong and to be good in athletics, but it doesn't teach football, and it doesn't teach tennis. So Fast Forward is building brain capacity, and then educators teach, and they work together. You don't want one, or curriculum by itself is excellent if a student has no excellent learning capacity, but many children do not, and that's really where neuroscience-based programs come in.
Okay. Let's see here. How long is the program, and is it based on how well a student progresses throughout the different sections?
Yes, so the program is self-adaptive, we say, so all the students can start, depending upon, there's a pre-test students can take that kind of puts them into a certain program. And then they'll start there, but the program will advance based on how well they do. It adapts to every single keystroke each student makes, so that you don't have to ever say, okay, it's time for this student to do this exercise, or it's time for this student to do this exercise in a harder way. The program is already making those decisions. And so when you have 5 students working on the same program, let's say Fast Forward Language at the same time, within about 3 days you'll see each of the students is on different levels in each exercise. And then when they're ready to switch from one program to the next, it actually tells you that. The data actually tells you, get a little switch flag and it says to move on. So that's one of the advantages. You don't have to, as a teacher, make the decision. It's all designed within the program itself.
Okay, so then the program itself, can you describe it a little bit more? What age groups it's appropriate for, and is it appropriate for middle school, elementary school, high school? And then the next question related to those questions is, does it focus on content-related academic language?
Okay, gosh, great questions. First of all, there are 2 sets of programs. One is called Fast Forward programs. The Fast Forward group of programs is 12 individual programs. Some of them are designed for the Fast Forward Language to Reading are designed for students who are about 5 to 12 years of age, and then Literacy and Literacy Advanced are designed for middle school and high school age students. And those are the students that build up the underlying cognitive skills primarily. So they're working on attentional skills, they're working on building the phonological map, they're working on being able to remember better, they're working on language, and somebody said, yes, both school-based vocabulary and general vocabulary, as well as grammar. So those are 4 programs, 2 for younger elementary students, 2 for middle school, high school students, that are designed to build up those underlying capacities and language skills. And in addition to that, then, we also have reading products, Fast Forward reading products, that essentially build up those same capacities with reading activities, reading comprehension activities, spelling activities, decoding activities, phonological awareness activities, and there are 5 of those programs, and 5 of those products, and they can be used all the way through high school. I actually use them with adults in junior college who are still having reading problems. Then we have Reading Assistant, which is a self-corrective reading program, oral reading program, where the student hears passages or stories read aloud or text from science books read aloud or geography books read aloud, and then they read it themselves, and then the computer corrects them as they're reading it. And those texts are designed for students all the way from first grade all the way through the 12th grade. The prerequisite skills the students need, they need about a 3-year level, and by that I don't mean grade level, I mean 3-year-old level of language skills. So they need a little bit of language vocabulary to get started on fast forward language. They need to have a little bit of sentence structure, know some things like color words, and you want to make sure, and we have some guides that can help them get ready for fast forward language. But other than that, there's really no prerequisite for fast forward language or language to reading. Reading 1, they start when they're ready to start doing decoding and phonological awareness skills, and then they go all the way through high school. I think I answered all the questions.
The next question is, how much time do the students need per day to work on this?
All right, there are several different protocols. There is the shortest protocol recommended is 30 minutes a day, and ELL students can do 30 minutes a day 3 times a week if they would like. And we found that with English language learners, that's an effective protocol. Now, if you have an English language learner that also has other issues, let's say that the native language is not very well developed, then you would want a more intensive protocol. And the intensity can go to 40 minutes 3 times a week, or 50 minutes 3 times a week, or you can do 5 days a week of 30 minutes a day. So there's a lot of flexibility built in, and you can go all the way to 80 minutes a day if you want, 5 days a week. So depending upon how quickly you want the student to be performing better in the classroom, and what your time constraints are in a school for everything else the student has to do and all the curriculum that they have to cover, what you can do is design a protocol. If you do, let's say, 30 minutes a day 3 times a week, then you're going to probably be thinking about this will take about a semester and a half to get through the programs that this student really is going to need the products to be able to function well in the classroom. If, on the other hand, you use a more intensive protocol, let's say that you decide at the beginning of the year to put your ELL students in this for 45 minutes or 40 minutes, 5 days a week, then you're going to see changes within a semester that are pretty dramatic. So, and you can even have changes that are faster than that. We like to say fast forward intervention is fast and enduring. Now, for the Reading Assistant program, after the student has learned English and we're trying to fine-tune their reading aloud and their oral reading skills, then you can use Reading Assistant. They have to have a reading level of about 2nd grade to get started with Reading Assistant effectively, or end of 1st grade. But once they can do that, that's a variable schedule. You can just do that in place of oral reading groups. You can do it 2-3 times a week, or you can combine Reading Assistant with Fast Forward. You can do Fast Forward 3 times a week, let's say for 30 minutes, and do Reading Assistant twice a week for 30 minutes. So there are lots of different ways to use this and to increase the power of it. Generally speaking, the brain is a use it or lose it organ. It is a use-dependent organ. We say experience-dependent. So the more you do these exercises, and the more time the students devote on them, the faster the results you will see.
Next question is, many people claim that ELLs are mostly prone to doing poorly in school as compared to native speakers. What's your take on that?
Well, actually, the research of Judith Kroll that I talked about, excuse me, shows that bilinguals are actually better in school if they reach the second language competence. So where the English language learner is at a disadvantage is when their English language is very poor or is not, if they're not competent in the English language, then they're going to have a great deal of difficulty listening to a teacher and learning from a teacher who's speaking in English. Just makes kind of common sense when you think about it. But it's not that they're English language learners that it's the problem. It's that their English isn't good enough to benefit. But then keep in mind, we also have these other issues with English language learners. We have the stress of the English language learning environment, which affects the way the brain learns. So we have multiple factors that can contribute to ELL learners having trouble in school, but it isn't the English language learning itself that's the problem. It's all these other kinds of issues that surround the English language learner.
Okay, so next question is, does the brain image change by the use, does the brain change by the use of fast forward for older learners?
Yes, so we have research that was actually done. We have fMRI research that was done by Elise Temple at Stanford University, and we have what you see on our website. If you go to our website, you'll actually see the research she did with children who were readers and children who were struggling readers that were about 7 years of age. But actually the very first research study she did was with adults. And what she showed was if you look at adults and you do fast forward with them, adults who've had a history of reading impairments and you do fast forward with them, not only does their reading improve, but their brain changes as well. And the parts of the brain that change after you use fast forward are fast forward language and literacy and language reading and literacy advanced. The parts of the brain that we have research that show we change are the parts of the brain that are affected by not only poverty but also stress, and the parts of the brain that have to be fine-tuned for an English language learner.
Thank you very much, and this will conclude our session for today. Bye-bye.